Jonathan Norman, and I'm talking to Elmar Kutsch, who is Associate Professor of Risk at Cranfield University. Elmar, we're talking a bit about organisational resilience, so let's start with a definition. What is organisational resilience?
Well, organisational resilience has traditionally been defined as bouncing back from adversity, so a very defensive perspective. But now a modern form of organisational resilience is also how to exploit opportunities, to be innovative and to disrupt a market rather than just trying to protect your own market and your own degree of competitive advantage.
So how does that relate to major projects, for example?
Well, in the same way, if we define a project as an organizational entity which is temporary, then the same principles or the same definition also applies to project. So in a project we have to define of whether we want to be somewhat defensive, bouncing back from adversity, protecting the requirements that we have defined for ourselves in this project, or whether we are somewhat adaptive and progressive in managing a project.
That's interesting, because I think a lot of major projects would recognise the former and be more uncomfortable with the latter.
Yes, and this is also how we define how we manage a project. Often we receive a framework that allows us to go through a project in a stepwise process, a very somewhat defensive approach with an emphasis on consistency in action, and yet why not carrying out a project in a very much progressive way, where flexibility is the forefront, where we do not at the beginning define rigidly of how we approach a project, but we allow flexibility to flourish, we allow ways of working to emerge rather than being predefined right at the start of a project. We see of what a project team is good at and not necessarily what they're supposed to do right at the start. So there we have often a mismatch between what are we good at and what we're supposed to do. Here, in terms of a progressive way of managing a project, we first look at how shall we manage it in order to fit the project and the way of how we manage a project with the environment per se.
You're suggesting that sometimes the past is relevant, but at other times you need to change and adapt. So just trying to be better at doing what you did last time is not necessarily the way forward.
Yes, and this is how I traditionally have experienced project management, where we focus very much on the past, we somewhat recycle it, and this defines of how we manage a project and what we are supposed to manage. And yet a more progressive view of organizational resilience also focuses on mindfulness or mindful action, where instead of focusing or just focusing on hindsight, we also create this foresight. To some extent we detach ourselves from the past, we look at the problem, the project at hand, and then we create novel ways of dealing with this project. And this is a form of organizational resilience that is often being neglected.
I know one of your particular interests is history and recent history and learning lessons from history. And in your last book, you really looked at the fall of France as an analogy for exploring resilience, organisational resilience.
Yes.
What can we learn from history and from that kind of example?
So in 1940, Nazi Germany invaded France, and within a period of 6 weeks brought the juggernaut France at that time to its knees. And you might, although it is somewhat difficult to define it as a project, you could learn lessons from it, because France and Germany deployed a very much different approach of how to manage a project, how to invade a country and how to defend a country in this respect. And whereas I want to say France has applied a very much traditional approach to managing this project, of repelling an invasion, Germany at that stage applied a very much progressive view of managing this project, because what Germany couldn't allow to do is to repeat the lessons from World War I, so they had to do something different. And from this case study, a lot of new standards and frameworks emerged in military science, such as mission command or the concept of intent. I still see many projects are still carried out in a French way of working, of how the French conducted war in the 1940s. Whereas the Germans applied a very much progressive way to organizational resilience and a progressive way to project management in this respect, where they relied very much on novel concepts such as Auftragstaktik, where you empower your frontline soldiers, frontline employees, and where you provide your organization with a high degree of flexibility, given the nature of war and given the nature also of projects in this respect. What I sometimes complain about in the classroom is that all these military concepts, which are now the norm on the battlefield and in military organizations, are not really applied on organizations, especially the more progressive form of organizational resilience. Many organizations still rely on hindsight, on compliance, on centralized decision making, whereas the Germans in the 1940s very much relied on decentralization, concepts of mindfulness, and concepts of progressive organizational resilience in order to disrupt the French war machine to that extent that after even 5 days they reached their breaking point in this case study. So this case study is quite interesting, as it showcases two archetypal forms of organizational resilience, and the more progressive one prevailed over the more defensive one. And this is quite interesting because at that stage, Nazi Germany was a far inferior military power if compared to the French, the Dutch, the Belgians, and also the British Expeditionary Force at that stage.
I think there are a lot of projects or perhaps programs that are quite close to that. I mean, I'm thinking about some aspects of mergers and acquisitions where there is an element of supreme competition, not necessarily warfare, but you're beating the opposition, or indeed just organizational competitive tactics where you are trying to maintain or gain a position in a highly competitive market. And I think there's a lot that's very close to that, to what you describe in the book, and the need not only to be able to make sense of the world and move forward yourselves, but to disrupt the competition and prevent them from stopping you doing what you want to do.
Yes, and in this respect, there are some forms that makes it difficult, or some aspects in war that makes it difficult to translate lessons learned to modern contemporary management cases. For example, ideology and conscription, which we probably, hopefully, won't find in modern management cases. And yet, whenever we look at management cases, we often find the same mistakes and the same approaches to organizational resilience. It's usually either or. But what I can say is that in many, maybe too many organizations, they operate like the French did in the 1940s, where compliance was at the forefront. Again, decentralized decision making. And yet, it is not to no surprise, because we have to remind ourselves what capabilities the French had at their disposal at that time. They were actually working with a conscript army, with little capabilities and little experience at the front line. And so in this respect, I understand that they adopted a very much defensive way of managing their conscript army, where the Germans at that stage, and Hastings said it was the most professional army at that time, were able to rely on greater expertise and greater capabilities to adopt a more progressive, disruptive, as he said, disruptive way of organizational resilience. They were able to allow their frontline soldiers, their non-commissioned officers, to improvise because they were capable of improvising. Whereas on the French and on the Allied side in general, you had largely a conscript army that was ill-equipped to improvise in the moment.
Where do you see this going over the next sort of 5 or 10 years? How do you see organizational resilience developing?
So what we see right now, there's a demand, there's a hunger for defining what resilience is, and in practice, what does it actually mean? So in theory, at our university, we are engaging very much with the concept of organizational resilience. And currently we're working also with the British Standards Institution to develop a new framework on organizational resilience. So where does it go? I think organizations require practical ideas of what organizational resilience means, because currently it's kind of a holistic concept that means everything and nothing at the same time. So now we're in the process of defining more and more of those practical frameworks for organizations and projects that can be applied. So organizations can use these frameworks, turn these into assessment tools, hopefully not into tools that make people compliant again, for the reason of not just being defensive, but also opening up a discourse in an organization to see, shall we be defensive? Shall we be progressive? Shall we rely more on consistency in action? Or shall we rely more on a greater flexibility in our organization to be, for the purpose of being resilient in an environment that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous? So hopefully in the next 10 or 20 years, we see more practical frameworks emerging that allow organizations to make sense of organizational resilience and apply it, not just in theory, but apply it in reality.